This is Chapter 5, International Conflict. I had decided not to break this up into 2 lectures, so we've got lots to talk about here. First of all, let's look at the types of wars. World war, or hegemonic war, between two major powers and alliances, less likely to happen in today's world because of the institutions that we've created since World War II and the interdependence that we have between countries and their economies. Still possible if alliances were to form. Limited war typically is looking at a military action, which would generally mean a state action to pursue some sort of objective against an adversary. Those are also fairly rare in today's world. Civil wars are predominantly the type of wars that we have today, where we're looking at wars between factions within a state. I've already mentioned this several times before, that there are more wars within states than there are between states. And as a result, a lot of these are guerrilla type wars, particularly with terrorist-related wars, non-state actors that don't have the same resources, so they have to rely on other tactics. Since it's within the country, there's no front lines. It's difficult to distinguish civilians or detect an enemy if somebody behind you could be carrying a bomb. There's also the changing nature of war, particularly with technological advances that were more available on the internet, the ability to kill from groups that are able to put together weapons. Strategies have changed, particularly with non-state actors, more guerrilla tactics. The insurgents in a state, therefore, are motivating the states to engage in what we call these counterinsurgency type of conflicts or anti-terror type situations, where again we're dealing with mostly non-state actors that are not happy with the state that they're in, not able to coexist with other groups. We'll look at that in more detail. No front lines, no uniforms, no rules on the prisoners of war, which is why you would see a terrorist group that has no state responsibility could execute someone on the internet. Big rise in civilian casualties since the 1980s. The wounded to dead ratio in Vietnam, for example, was 3-1. In the Iraq-Afghanistan wars, it was 16-1. This is primarily to these guerrilla-type tactics and the type of weapons that non-state actors have to use, such as IEDs, explosive devices, with lots of shrapnel that creates more injuries. These types of conflicts are much more difficult to win, even the conflicts that the United States have been in. It's arguable that any one had been won, particularly since World War II. Causes of war, these are some general theories, rational decisions, or even you could say irrational decisions of leaders that are convinced that they need to do this. During the Cold War, there was the greedy capitalist versus the totalitarian communist perceptions out there that resulted in some proxy wars. Power transition theory touched on that, rising versus falling powers, such as between World War I and World War II. And then theories that are looking at long-term change cycles, people tend to forget, as well as hang on to long-term revenge and hostilities, so those could be general causes. What we want to focus on more here are the concepts of nationalism combined with ethnicity, which is the biggest source of wars in the world today, and then religion and ideology are infused in those that are bringing these ethnicities, these culturally homogeneous populations together. Then we'll look at some of these other interest-related causes for war as well. This is from the Council of Foreign Relations website, looking particularly from the United States foreign policy perspective, where the hot spots in the world are and what may be most critical to the U.S. interests. We see that there are 2 of them over here have to do with China's involvement in the South China Sea, the tensions with North Korea, Iran, for example. Ethnocentrism is something that we've touched on that is a human universal, which means that people are socialized into a culture where they feel like their culture is the best one or superior to other cultures. This is normal to be socialized that way, even if it's not intentional. It's just something that we've become comfortable with and feel that ours is more superior. But these can also morph into more extremes, such as exceptionalism, isolationism, exclusionism, keeping people out, the in-group versus out-group concept that is the source of many wars in the world today when people form their identity groups. Nationalism has other isms that are associated with it. Patriotism can intensify that, loyalty to your homeland, to the common values of your group. Imperialism is where a state wants to extend its authority, creating an empire over other states. The British Empire, Western European expansionists, even the United States toyed with imperialism somewhat at the beginning of the 20th century. Kind of an outmoded concept, particularly amongst democratic states, but certainly a motivation of states that might be wanting to expand their power, most obviously Russia and potentially China. Militarism is where the military power or the efficiency of the military is the supreme ideal, worst case scenario, of course, being Hitler's fascism. Here, more specifically, this concept of ethno-nationalism. Ethnicity is a shared cultural pattern where you could have a shared history. A shared language is a very strong bonding element. Shared religion, also very strong. Some form of national origin that you could identify with another group based on your history in that region of being the dominant group or being an oppressed group, either one. So group identity forms over many generations through extended kinship, clans, and then they're breeding this in-group bias, which then creates potentially, as we know that this is the biggest source of conflict in the world right now, the desire for nation states where that group that is identified through its ethnicity or its culturally homogenous population, therefore wants a state. This nationalism feeds the right for that group to have its own boundaries, its own state, its own sovereignty that matches its culture or its ethnicity. This brings up that concept we've touched on just briefly, the idea of self-determination, which is what the United States perhaps was founded upon. We wanted to determine our own destiny, or could it be just a matter of separatism because groups cannot coexist within the same state? In many states, indigenous populations are often discriminated and oppressed, so therefore they have that shared identity that makes them want to break away and form their own groups. A lot of groups, the Unrepresented Nations Peoples Organization, people can apply to this group and then put the word out there that they are vying for recognition. Goal, of course, is political independence, and that might not necessarily result in a sovereign state. It could even result in a form of federalism where those groups would have more autonomy within that state. So there are options out there, but nevertheless, these groups are having problems coexisting in their states and are looking for some form of separation or independence. And then when you have this separation of groups, then this concept of dehumanizing can then facilitate, if you consider yourself better than that other group or right, or that other group being evil, then you can equate the enemy to animals, which will then facilitate killing and potentially mass killing or genocide. And we've seen some examples of this just in our recent history. Looking more at self-determination, again, the roots go all the way back to the American Revolution, as well as Woodrow Wilson in the post-World War I idealism, where the America's attempts at imperialism was pulled back, and then it was recommended that states start to pursue their own independence. In today's world, where a lot of this is revolving around groups that can't coexist within states, again, we also have to look at the fact that colonialism carved up a lot of these boundaries without looking at these identity groups as far as trying to separate them. And the boundaries were carved up. In some cases, oil companies were involved in determining these borders. Even to this day, these groups have still long-term animosity with that. We have seen other alternatives to self-determination or this separation, because in practice it has become more problematic. If groups want to gang together or clan up, then that starts to have a tendency to tribalism, which then exacerbates conflicts between groups. Then you've got the logistics that are required to disentangle groups that are within states and potentially dissolving states or creating new states, which could be little more than microstates that literally could not sustain themselves and would not be self-sufficient on their own. And when this continues to happen, where states break up or have regional wars that spread out, spill over, that other countries get involved, particularly the superpowers may need to get involved, this increases the potential for international stability. And I've said before, the vast majority of conflicts in the world today are within states, not between states. So what is the primary alternative to that? Well, we've seen it for the past 200 years, a potentially viable alternative, but it takes a lot of work and effort and time, is a more inclusive democracy. We see that with the United States, Canada, Britain, very diverse cultures, but very stable, politically speaking, very inclusive democracies, not perfect, none of them will be perfect, but a more inclusive democracy that results in much more stability and development. But it has to evolve over many generations. And as we'll see as we go through this class, a lot of states in the world have not even started the transition, much less the evolution. And then once that transition starts, it will evolve over several generations. So this is why this would be a very long-term process. So let's look at some examples of how nationalism and ethnicity have come together to either create conflict or potential separations. The idea of one nation being one state, you see that only about 10% of the states in the world have the vast majority of the peoples within their borders. That is, the people that then identify with that nation. And the United States, interestingly enough, is one of those countries. Once people move to the United States, or have grandparents may have immigrated here and they're socialized in this country, it is a very strong identity to be American, to be a part of this American system. And 98% of Americans live in the United States, and still more people wanting to come here as we speak and then assimilate or blend in, enculturate, whatever, get a hold of some of the opportunities that may be here in order to become part of the American system as well. America, comparatively speaking, it's not perfect, and we're seeing some cracks that could potentially be getting worse right now. But in general, the United States has a higher national pride with identifying as American. It has this obviously might be surprising to you at the current times, but it has the lowest gap in pride between groups. When you look at the overall pride of being in a country like America, the gap's less pronounced than it is in other countries. And this ethnic diversity has evolved together over time into this American culture. However, that's been defined over many, many generations. So that is something that we have to look at in perspective with other countries. I know when you're sitting right in the middle of it, sometimes it's hard to see that perspective. Here is a map showing the minority populations in the world of all the countries, and it's on the verge of being updated because we see here that United States is between, according to this map, 21 to 30% of its minority population, and that's already exceeding 30%. So therefore, the United States would already be popped up into this green category similar to Canada as far as our diversity goes. And it is predicted that by the year 2050, the majority of Americans will be of a ethnic group, primarily Black, Hispanic, and Asian. They will outnumber the white population by 2050. For the United States, that number is actually growing. The more diverse populations, as you can see, in Africa, to where percentage of the total populations in groups other than majority, this is because of more fractured clans and tribalist type aspects, lots of breakups, lots of different groups in Africa, which contributes to its instability. And here on the other end of the spectrum, where less than 10% of their population is minority, here we have very homogeneous cultures such as China, which probably lends itself to being an authoritarian state, because if you have a vast majority of the population that identifies as one group, then authoritarian leadership would be more likely to tell people what to do. We're also seeing that what minority groups there are in China, such as the Uyghurs, are being oppressed so that they don't affect the consensus that exists in the Communist Party, for example. Other countries that have a very strong religious element, such as a strong Catholic population or a strong Muslim population, they would also be a little bit less diverse. Any diversity being introduced into the system would be potentially destabilizing. So that's why democracy is difficult, because those diverse elements are going to want to come out once it starts transitioning to a democracy, and that could be conflictual. Let's look at one state with multiple nations in it. 30% of all states have no nation that constitutes a majority. Interestingly enough, Canada is one of those. 25% of Canada is ethnically French, and the majority of these reside in Quebec, which 80% considers themselves culturally French. And you can see on newscasts or news reports when somebody from Quebec is being interviewed, they most or often are speaking in French. So they highly identify with that, to the point where in 1995, Quebec actually pursued a referendum to separate from Canada. It was barely defeated. And then once that was defeated, people started to realize, well, that would be a lot of work for Quebec to separate out and be its own country, when you look at how much any state relies on federal or central government revenues. And then when you look at the size of Quebec, the amount of resources that would be in Quebec, the population, the manpower in Quebec, obviously Canada as a whole would certainly not want that to happen. No state would really want to just give up a huge chunk of its resources. So that's part of the problem. You've got groups that want to break away, and you've got central government elements that says, no, we don't want that to break away. So this is where a lot of the conflict ensues. Here's another situation where Rwanda in Central Africa had high tensions for quite a while, when the minority Tutsis had been controlling government for quite a while, and that's always a sore spot. That's also what happened in Iraq and in South Africa. Lots of examples where a minority population had total control of a vast majority of the population. So in this case, in 94, an assassination of a Hutu government leader sets off a violent chain reaction, and the minority Tutsis, who were no longer in charge, so some of this was payback from way back, were massacred by the extremist Hutus, and approximately 800,000 men, women, and children were murdered in 100 days. Just unbelievably brutal conflict over that period, and the international community pretty much just stood by and watched. Belgium did attempt to get involved eventually, since their former colony of Belgium, The United Peacekeeping Forces were already there, but could not. They were pretty much helpless once the conflict reached a threshold and was out of control. And this is one of the conflicts in the 90s that caused the superpowers, particularly the United States and Britain, to kind of reevaluate their role in the world. And not long after that, they got more directly involved in the Bosnian War. You can see that Rwanda is a very small country right here in Central Africa, but nonetheless, a lot of conflict came out of that region, still simmering to this day between those two groups that have long historical differences that you or I would not be able to tell one of them apart from the other. But it goes deeper than color of the skin. It goes deeper than that. It's a long identity that people are socialized into. Looking at one nation with multiple states, this is where a nation or a people's overlaps the borders of two or more states, particularly because those countries were formed without really taking these indigenous groups or these ethnic groups in mind when they were doing that. One of the examples here, of course, is North and South Korea, same groups of peoples, but very different politically because of the split over communism. Same thing here with North and South Vietnam. Similar here when East and West Germany were split over communism. They also reunified. The differences between Ireland and Northern Ireland are primarily religious. Catholic majority of Ireland versus a Protestant minority in Northern Ireland. Look at a map here in a second. And the Azerbaijanis in the Middle East, 2/3 of them actually live in Iran. So those are potential conflict inducers here when you've got a group that is not really even all living within the borders of its state that it identifies with, but is spilled over into other states. Here's Ireland, and here's the border with Northern Ireland. So you could see how tensions could arise here. And with the Brexit, this border has become a little bit more of a hot border now, whereas before, since UK and Ireland were both members of the EU, this border was not as important, a little bit more porous. Since the Brexit, then it has become a little bit more a solid border there. No signs of conflict brewing back up. Those tensions have pretty much eased for the most part, which were religious driven. There's Azerbaijan right there, and a big chunk of that population lives down here in this region of Iran. The split in Ukraine is quite clear when you see that almost the entire eastern section of Ukraine are Russian speaking. So therefore, they would have a more of an inherent tendency to side with Russia. Russia has exploited that, and that is the seat of the tensions there in Ukraine that are still existing to this day, where the group of Russian-speaking peoples would not have a problem with splitting apart and going back into the fold with Russia. So again, language, very strong bonding element. Looking at one nation without any state at all, a few examples here, such as the Kurds, who are originally promised a state back in the 1920s, and this is when the oil companies were kind of involved in this remapping at the end of the imperialist era there. But the Kurds, that deal fell through, and about 1/2 of Kurds live in Turkey, and that's why there's conflict to this day between the Kurdish element and the Turkish government. Iran and Iraq each have about 25% of the Kurds. Another example is the Palestinians. The Jewish population, which had been looking for land because of the oppression that they had been experiencing for decades, centuries actually, but the movement started in the early 1900s, where land was purchased in the original Transjordan area, and by 1948, 650,000 Jewish population had migrated there. and they were granted their statehood. Almost immediately, conflict broke out with Israel and the surrounding countries. And then, of course, the Palestinian issue has remained ever since as far as how those populations coexist. Here's where Kurdistan could likely be if it was given a state. You can see that big chunk of Turkey is primarily Kurdish population, and then a fairly sizable chunk here of Iran. And then when you look at the Iraqi Kurdistan, which is right here, blown up a little bit there, during the Iraq War, the Iraqi Kurds had actually applied for their own independence. That was opposed by the forces that be, including the United States, that was trying to recreate Iraq in a democratic system to where groups would figure out how to coexist through representation, federalism, whatever system might work to get groups to coexist. That's still kind of the long-term goal, rather than just have groups break up into their own little territories and then conflict still ensues because those groups still can't get along. Here's Israel with the West Bank. There has been some movement as far as Israel's reaching out to other Middle East countries, but the situation with West Bank remains. Gaza Strip is run by Hamas, which is a recognized terrorist group, and this is where most of the conflict ensues when Hamas extremists provoke Israel, which then retaliates. Looking at multiple nations and multiple states within these regions, Afghanistan is an example. Afghanistan is one of the most unstable, underdeveloped countries in the entire world, and part of the reason is that it's got such a mix of identity groups that, there's lack of development, lack of education. There's really no desire for any type of unifying or central government. There's no sense of a nationhood. Blood, kinship is still more important to these groups than any government could do for them. Even when they were polling people during the Afghanistan war about 10 years ago in these tribal regions that are potentially just sheep herders or crop growers that just wanted to live their lives, and they would poll these people and they would ask him about Al-Qaeda or 9/11, and they would not know what that meant. Chechnya is a very small state republic in Russia, but it's been a big source of conflict primarily because it is a Muslim area and goes way back. Chechens were deported in World War II to Siberia, where 1/3 of them died. And even though it is a Republic of Russia, it has its own national anthem, which the lyrics in their national anthem assert death or freedom. So there have been some conflicts there in Chechnya, which is also a place where the Boston Marathon bombers were radicalized. Here's a map of Afghanistan with its varied assortment of ethnic groups, which also includes a couple of major regions here in Pakistan as well. Russia is a very, very large state, but Chechnya is just a very small region right here in this toe of Russia. Next to Georgia, there's the region of Chechnya. Now let's look at some other causes of conflict that also feed into this. One, of course, is the religious differences, whereas extremism and fundamentalism are sources of conflict because they are clashing with change and modernity. Have to keep in mind that every religion has fundamental extremist elements, not just the Islamic religion. There are extremist elements in every religion in the world, so we have to be clear on that. What we're seeing where most of the conflict is particularly the Sunni versus Shia divide in the nations of Islam because of other extenuating circumstances such as underdevelopment or authoritarian systems and things like that. Even though there are extremist elements in the United States, they do not have the same opportunities to fester or grow into large conflictual type issues. Fundamentalism typically opposes the secular ideas or the undermining of old traditional religious values. So there's a general resistance to modernization, a resistance to this cultural amalgamation where more than likely there's going to be westernized values of consumerism and materialism and sexualization of society that they are going to be resistant against. Poor, vulnerable countries are more susceptible to fundamentalism because there's less education, there's more underdeveloped regions that could be susceptible for recruiting, more disillusionment that are susceptible to recruiting to terrorist, extremist type ideas, and even educated young men that are in the region that don't have jobs could also be candidates for recruiting into these extremist groups. Looking at the example of India, Pakistan, that is also a major religious divide. Hindu, predominant religion of India, and we also seeing a more nationalist movement in India that is becoming even more Hindu-motivated type nationalist idea, current leaders there. And versus Pakistan, Muslim state, they've had 3 wars since their formation at the end of World War II, where India got independence from British Empire, but they split off into these 2 groups. What makes this a particularly interesting situation to keep an eye on is they both have nuclear weapons. Neither of them have signed any of these non-proliferation treaties, but it is common knowledge that they have them, and they want people to know that they have them for deterrence purposes so that the other country does not attack them. In the United States, this may be waning a little bit, but particularly as we get into the 80s and the 90s, the rise of evangelical Christians started to influence particularly the conservative side of politics. Religious right did have an influence on the Republican Party, perhaps even a little bit of element of formation of the Tea Party, which is a more conservative element of the Republican Party. Looking a little bit more at Islam, Islamic actors have been active participants in 10 of the 17 most critical conflicts that we saw on that map. The concept of jihad has led to false stereotypes. As I've said, any religion can have conflictual elements to it, extremist elements, but only 1 out of 4 Muslims are Arab. We'll look at some maps here in a minute. There's also a history of conflict with Christian powers going way back. The Crusades and then the domination by European powers, the way that the Middle East regions were divided up by the imperial powers. There's also a resistance to this Western dominance in the materialist type concepts that come out of Western capitalism. The Muslims in general identify more strongly with their religion than their country, even though we do see kind of a hegemonic divide in the Middle East where Iran, that is more identified with the Shia side, is perhaps aligning a little bit up against Saudi Arabia, which aligns more with the Sunni side of Islam. Looking at the Muslim states of the world here, the most populated Muslim state is actually Indonesia. But this is the region here where Muslim states are congregated. The concept of sectarianism means that these religious groups are creating sects, S-E-C-T, that are dividing up against each other and becoming a root cause of conflict. The Iraq War, which was begun by the United States, we've already touched on that, and we'll touch on a little bit more as to the mixed results that came out of that, as well as what some other things that influenced. One of the things that influenced was this reopening of the split between the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds, as well as inspired more terrorist groups as a result of this split. Even after the dust of the war settles out, there was groups that were not happy with what they got. Therefore, terrorist elements started to come out of some of those groups. The Shiite majority of Iraq was now subject to the influence of Shiite Iran. Saddam Hussein was more sympathetic to the Sunnis, the minority population which controlled the country for so long, even resulted in a war with Iran. Once that the Shia majority took back control, kind of ostracized the Sunnis somewhat, which led to the reformation of some other extremist groups. In addition to that, they started to align a little bit more with Iran, essentially turn their backs a little bit on the U.S. Also, keep in mind that there's some other elements that we have to look at. Iraqis are Arab, whereas Iranians are Persian. That is certainly an important distinction in that region. There's a perception that despite these internal divisions, the conflict still seems to be driven by Western interests. Now, that is certainly very debatable when you look at the vast majority of this conflict now is between the Sunni and the Shia elements. Yes, the Western interest facilitated a lot of that going way back. This colonialism set up this divide that's even to this day kind of at the foundation of a lot of this conflict. But however, we also have to look that without the Western interests no longer involved, these groups are still at odds with each other over their religious differences there. So it's becoming less and less of a valid excuse to use that. Here's a chart looking at the overall population of Islam. The bigger group is the Sunni group, and these are some of the subgroups and where those groups typically reside. Here on the Shia side, we've already talked about how some of the major splits there are Iran and Iraq on the Shia side, and then most predominantly Saudi Arabia on the Sunni side. Most of the extremist elements, such as Al-Qaeda and the groups that have come up out of that, have been out of this group here, primarily out of Saudi Arabia. 16 of the 19 terrorists of 9/11 were actually Saudi Arabian, even though Osama bin Laden was no longer in Saudi Arabia. He had been banned and banished, exiled from the country years before that because they didn't even want to deal with him. Looking at some more state alignments here, this is how it can get so confusing. Just looking at the United States, we're typically looking at supporting the Yemen government, opposing the Houthi rebels, which are supported by Iran. We're typically looking at supporting the Kurdistans because of the help that they gave us, particularly in the Iraq War, but yet at the same time supporting the Iraqi government. Then we also are looking at the miscellaneous rebel groups in Syria as opposed to the authoritarian leading Syrian government or the Islamic State terrorist groups that come out of that. But yet some of these miscellaneous rebel groups start to have terrorist elements as well, because particularly in Syria, that conflict degenerated very quickly. It started out as a pro-democracy uprising, but then quickly degenerated into a religious sectarian conflict. This shows you how confusing it can be. Looking at some other causes, ideological conflict is not necessarily a big factor in today's world, particularly since the end of the Cold War, which that communism versus capitalism divide seemed to provide a lot of root motivations for conflict. Today, revolutions tend to lose their ideological fervor, and if, as we've just seen throughout this lecture here, many examples, they start to turn very quickly to the pursuit of national interest, more often a power struggle between ethnic factions. And so the ideological aspect of it kind of falls by the wayside, and these revolutions rarely get exported, or they rarely diffuse to other states so that some ideological movement can take shape. That rarely happens, so because it becomes more of a struggle between these ethnic factions. The Arab Spring uprisings were driven by democracy, but only one of those, and that was Tunisia, has shown really much signs of success, whereas the others, as you look at Libya, Egypt, particularly Syria, now Yemen, the very conflictual, very problematic. Territorial disputes, not quite as an issue nowadays, but this concept of regaining lost territory still could crop up. Bolivia and Chile just resolved a dispute with the International Court of Justice that Bolivia thought that it should have access to the ocean because Chile had taken some land from them that connected Bolivia to the ocean there, but now they've been landlocked ever since. But the International Court of Justice ruled against Bolivia and says can't force Chile to give that back up. Argentina and Chile share a very long border, so they've had some disputes before. 78, recent one. Nigeria did actually cede some land to Cameroon in 2006. This concept of secession, not likely, not too common. Existing state typically does not want to lose that area in question. Kosovo wants to secede from Serbia, which does not want it to. Chechnya wants to secede from Russia. Despite the conflict, Russia still does not want to just give it up. And probably most prominent, the desire for Taiwan to be recognized as an independent state, China not wanting them to do that, even though Taiwan in many ways acts as an independent state. Looking at some more territorial issues here, Israel did return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in those Camp David Accords in 1979. They did retain the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and Golan Heights. Still contentious issues there, but that treaty did make some progress, and it still holds up today. One of the reasons why Egypt and Israel are two of the biggest benefactors of U.S. foreign aid. Kashmir has flared up several times, just even recently. It's primarily a Muslim region, but it is part of India's territory, and two of these wars between India and Pakistan have been over Kashmir, to where Pakistan feels like that since it is a Muslim region, it should be part of Pakistan. Spratly Islands are part of that South China Sea that I talked about earlier, where China has pretty much just assumed control of these islands, even though they are far out of that 200-mile exclusion zone. They pretty much have just assumed control of those because of the traffic that they rely on through the South China Sea. The UN Law of the Sea does give states a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. We'll look at that a little bit more detail later on. China has not really been abiding by that as far as their predominance in the South China Sea. Here's a little humorous note. There's a little tiny island between Greenland and Canada, just a big rock, but occasionally now Denmark, of course, is the country in charge of Greenland, so occasionally they send some people out there to leave a flag or whatever. For control of government, we've already talked about the Cold War, and that is over with. It's unlikely that we'll get into a same type of ideological or the control of other countries' governments. Still possible, but less likely. If we see some expansionism by Russia or China, could potentially get into some issues over control of government. We are seeing that with Hong Kong right now. So that is relevant today, that control of some government would be a source of conflict. Crimea is another example where Russia pretty much assumed control of Crimea because they wanted to go back to Russia, even though Ukraine certainly did not want that to happen. Or the idea of changing governments could cause conflict. That's still relevant. Even if today, if we're making these democratic transitions, there could be some problematic elements that come up during these transitions. So looking at the back, Soviet Union's issue with Czechoslovakia in 1968, in the United States invasion of Iraq, 2003, the primary reason of that was to get rid of Saddam Hussein and establish a more democratic-leaning government that would be sympathetic to U.S. interests. Economics leads less violence today due to our interdependence and transactions between countries. As I said before, the reasons to become democracies typically have less to do with prosperity than they do with freedom. Then people will hope that with these new freedoms, then the economic transitions will occur as well. We'll talk more about mercantilism later on, but that is where we have a nationalist-driven economy. So we are seeing some returns back to that, not quite the same as mercantilism, but we are looking at transitions, even in the United States, of pulling away from the international economy to pursue more national interests. The Marxist view, where global capitalism serves the interests of the rich, that could still be a source of conflict, of states not wanting to go capitalist or uprising up against capitalist issues. Even in America, the Occupy Wall Street, that was typically an uprising against the super rich. Drug trafficking, another potential source of conflict, particularly we've got drug cartels just south of our border in the United States. This opium sales literally is what's funded the Taliban for several years. So these are some other causes of wars, looking at economics. One last thing here, Barcelona had looked at trying to separate from Spain, primarily because most of the wealth is in Barcelona, so their taxes support a big chunk of the rest of the country. As you can see, 16% of Spain's population lives in Catalonia, this region right here that is circled, Barcelona being the capital. But yet, 1/4 of all of Spain's exports come out of this region. 19% of Spain's GDP is from this region. 20% of foreign investment comes there. That did not succeed, and that interest has quelled somewhat. So this has been a very densely packed chapter talking about several different causes of conflict, lots of different elements of conflict. So we will wrap it up here, and we'll talk in the next chapter about the military operations of states.